imagine the worst. It is autumn. A son or daughter goes away to school as they have always done, but this time it's forever.
If you see anything, don't be shy. I find a shirt, I find a shoe, I find a sock. You know what? That's what we're here for.
Try to keep the line as straight as possible.
This is the story of a son who disappeared, a family tragedy that has been compounded by a mystery. His name, Joe Grosel. A fit 21-year-old, a varsity athlete, a good student, popular.
There's no reason for us to believe one way or another about foul play, so you always look to the positive and that he's out there.
His sudden disappearance made no sense to anyone who knew him. His mother, Minnie Grosel.
Please, everybody in Kingston, look around. There could be some clue or something. Somebody's seen him. I think, what if something happened and he's waiting for us to find him? That hurts, I think. I don't want to be too late if it's something like that.
Joe was the fourth of 5 children in the family of Minnie and Ron Grosel. They have been a close, untroubled family until today.
That police just come home. Nothing is ever that bad. If that's what he's thinking, because he's such a good guy, but maybe sometimes you hide your feelings.
I go through my moments where, you know, you think positive and then you think the other way. All we can do is think positive.
The disappearance of Joe Grosel in October 2003 was troubling for many reasons, not the least of which was where it happened. When he disappeared, Joe Grosel was a third-year officer cadet at the Royal Military College in Kingston, Ontario, one of Canada's most revered public institutions. RMC is a guardian of military tradition, a crucible for future military leadership. Any hint of scandal here would have deep political resonance. The task of finding Joe Grosel was critical, and it fell to a military investigative unit that is rapidly becoming more renowned for damage control than for the quality of its police work. The history of RMC is embedded in the history of Canada. The military college first opened its doors in 1876. It was modeled on the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. Its motto, truth, duty, valor, signals high expectations for anyone who comes here. Lieutenant Colonel Rod MacDonald, who led the initial search for Joe Grosel, is now the registrar at RMC.
It's a huge adjustment for most people to come out of home life, possibly leaving home for the first time, make the transition from adolescence to adult, from the me-first type of attitude to a teamwork attitude.
Keep going! Don't stop!
Teamwork. From day one, it's all about the group dynamic, the essence of military discipline. The early weeks are more like boot camp than a university. A test of toughness, determination, the regimental spirit.
How hard are we?
I love each and every one of you guys.
Congratulations. Thanks, sir. Welcome to the group. Thanks, sir.
They arrive boisterously adolescent, but they will grow up here and in 4 years' time leave as educated and bilingual leaders.
Congratulations.
From RMC, many will go on to fill the highest ranks of Canada's military establishment.
It is therefore no accident that our characteristics, the characteristics of men and women in uniform like you, our values, mark and define our Canada.
Few who knew Joe Grosel growing up would have predicted a military future. He seemed too laid back. A skinny high school jock with a sentimental streak.
I'd like to share with everyone a revelation I've had that people are just all around mean to each other. Because I've noticed people act differently around different people with different color hair or different sex or even a different race. I don't really understand this because everyone's just the same. We're all human beings and we should be able to get along together.
Joe just seemed too gentle for the soldier's life. But there was another side to him. He was a born team player, a fierce competitor. His passion was basketball. Growing up in rural southwestern Ontario, he spent years becoming good at it. His older brother, Jim, was a star basketball player at the University of Western Ontario. Joe aspired to follow in his brother's footsteps. In 2001, he caught the eye of Craig Norman, then head coach of the basketball team at RMC. What kind of an impression did he make when you saw him on the court the first time?
He was small. You know, I knew he'd be challenged physically at that level, but he was a competitor, and he certainly had a high basketball IQ, and I felt we could certainly work with him and make him into a player at that level.
RMC is a demanding place, a university, but it's also a 9-year commitment. A 4-year degree program followed by 5 years mandatory military service. Joe was taking on a challenge that left his parents wondering if he really understood what he was getting into.
Oh, at first I was quite, Joe, are you sure you want to do this? I wasn't totally, all excited about it, but I thought, I hope you check it all out and see if this is what you want to do. And I think it's the basketball that was a big factor in deciding to go.
In the summer of 2001, Joe left home for the first time for basic military training in Saint-Jean, Quebec. He settled in, adapted to the military life while adjusting to a heavy academic workload. His friend, Kevin DeLude.
He was very productive. He was into the school more than others on the team as well. I mean, he was looking forward to getting bars, senior appointments within the school.
Basketball remained his first love, but he wasn't very big for varsity. He spent a lot of game time on the bench. There was never any guarantee he'd make the team, but what he lacked in body mass, he easily made up in brains and character. Coach Craig Norman.
He did his work. He got bigger physically. He put on 10 to 15 pounds, more mature, understood what he had to do, and he answered the challenge as far as I was concerned.
And he made the team.
He made the team.
In the calculus of hindsight, a more negative assessment of Joe Grozel's basketball abilities would take on surprising significance and become, for some, a decisive factor in his fate. But by all informed accounts, Joe had no illusions about basketball. He knew that he was too small to star, but he also knew that he was smart enough to lead, and more important, his teammates and his coaches knew it. In fact, for everyone who knew Joe Grozel as he started his 3rd year at RMC, he was an academic standout, a solid athlete, and he had all the qualities of a first-rate military officer.
He was, for the most part, what we would consider the RMC poster child, in that he was young, he was athletic, he was successful, and certainly if we were going to go out to a university fair, or to a guidance counselor show, or to a high school, he's exactly the kind of individual that we would want to represent.
Reunion weekend 2003. Joe's parents were visiting. He proudly showed his mom and dad around the campus with special attention to the rigors of the new cadets that year.
And I remember walking around a number of different events with Joe. Joe was beside me the whole time, and he was talking and describing things. Yelling at some of the students, at his buddies, and so on, and seemed to be having a great time. It was a good day.
It would be their last good day together. In the last week of October 2003, Ron and Minnie Grozel would get the call that every parent dreads. It was about Joe and the beginning of an ordeal that would change their lives completely.
And I called Ron, and he called RMC, and he came home, and I just thought, he can't be just not there.
October 21st, 2003. An unremarkable day at RMC, except in retrospect. Joe Grosel, normally conscientious, skipped 2 classes that morning, but he showed up at lunchtime, spoke to several cadets in the mess hall. That afternoon, he attended class as usual. Then, a regular 2-hour basketball practice. That evening, he had dinner with his teammates. By all later accounts, Joe Grosel seemed normal in every way. Joe had a girlfriend, Melissa Haggart, a classmate who was also a varsity athlete. She would later report that she and Joe went to his room at about 11 that night. At about 1 a.m., she saw Joe at his desk working on a paper that was due the next day. Then she fell asleep. She would never see Joe Grosel again. What happened next in the early morning hours of October 22nd, 2003 remains a dark and disturbing mystery 5 years later. Joe Grosel had simply vanished. Investigators would later find his wristwatch, wallet, and cell phone where he'd left them on the desk. His uniforms were hanging neatly in his closet. There was not a single clue as to where he might have gone or why. When he failed to turn up for breakfast, then for the 2nd day in a row missed his morning classes, his friends began to worry. Kevin DeLude.
When we went to his room and found that his uniform was there, his clothes was on the floor, his wallet, keys, or all his personal belongings were there, I think that's when we kind of were like, that's weird. And then speaking with Melissa and how she said that she'd woken up or whatever and he wasn't there, then we said, okay, let's try and figure out where he is and what, where is he. So that's when I think it was alarming and we kind of were a little confused.
DeLude called Coach Craig Norman. Joe's absence was completely out of character. It could have repercussions for the team, something Joe would never willingly allow. The coach didn't seem concerned at first, but he was curious.
So I called the family and said, is Joe like back home for some reason? Is something up? No, Craig, everything's, I'm sure he'll show up. But then he didn't come to practice that day, and that was the first practice he had missed. He'd been there for 2 years and 6 weeks, I guess. And that was the first practice he ever missed, so it was alarming.
By late afternoon, when nobody had set eyes on him for nearly 18 hours, his girlfriend Melissa notified their squadron commander. That night, she briefed the military police. Thursday morning, Coach Norman called Joe's parents again.
Hello? And then he said, I have to tell you, he missed the whole day classes, and really, we can't find Joe. Then I knew there was something wrong then.
There was something ominous about Joe's disappearance, and Coach Norman would soon find out just how sensitive the situation was.
I got called into my boss's office and told Director of Cadets doesn't want you to have contact with the family anymore. And
any reason why?
For me, that was a shock because I felt I had a responsibility to the family, to the kid, because I had recruited him, and I felt he wouldn't have been at RMC without us recruiting him there. And I knew the family. I would see them whenever they came down, and I don't know what their reasoning was, but obviously they were trying to keep the kibosh on something, but I wasn't sure of what it was. I was just interested in trying to find out where Joe was and what was happening with him.
The disappearance of Joe Grosel had all the makings of a crisis for the military brass, and it became apparent when 7 members of the Armed Forces National Investigation Service, the NIS, arrived in Kingston to take over the hunt for the missing cadet. It's the job of the NIS to investigate serious crimes involving military personnel. But also implicit in their mandate is the management of optics, controlling public fallout when military people get in trouble. Friday, October 24th, RMC officials sent a significant incident report to Defense Headquarters in Ottawa. It was a heads up. The absence of this particular cadet appears out of character. While there was as yet no media attention, it should be regarded as sensitive. Foul play was a possibility. Cadets were combing the 142-acre campus. They circulated flyers in the city with photographs of Joe Grosel. October became November. The search spread to the waters of Kingston Harbor.
Cadets and staff at RMC in Kingston say they're struggling to maintain hope that Joe Grosel will be found alive.
15 days into the search, radio reports were sounding grim.
It's an ominous sight for the hundreds of cadets who either know Joe Grosel or know of him.
Am I clear?
Yeah, you're clear.
Ontario Provincial Police divers were now probing the murky bottom of the Cataraqui River, which empties near the college. The waters are relatively shallow. If he was here, they were confident of finding him.
Over the years, we average about a 96 to 98% recovery rate in our investigations. I can't say for sure we're going to find anybody. We don't even know for sure he's in the water.
The diver spent days searching. He even used sonar to try to find him. But there was no trace of the missing cadet. Approaching mid-November, they were running out of options and running out of hope. Then it was the morning of November 13th. After 22 days of searching, an RMC employee walking across a small causeway to the campus noticed something floating near the shore. The search was over.
Mr. Grosel is dealing with it here locally as best he can, talking with his family now. Some of his family will be joining him a little bit later on, but one can only try and imagine what they're going through.
Ron Grosel was summoned to the Kingston General Hospital morgue.
We went in. Joe was laying on a table, blanket over him, and I looked at him, and I had no difficulty whatsoever said, yep, that's Joe. There's no question in my mind that was Joe.
Joe Grosel would get a military funeral in Chatham, Ontario. For Melissa Haggard, who had last seen Joe hunched over a school assignment exactly 1 month earlier, it was a moment of incomprehension. The ancient rituals marked a kind of closure for the military, but for the Grosel family it was anything but closure. A healthy 21-year-old was in his grave, and nobody seemed able or willing to tell them why.
We took Joe home, and we had no idea why we were taking this guy home. Like, why is he coming home in a box?
By early 2004, life returned to normal at the military college. The precise routines of military life obliged cadets to focus on the moment and the future. Joe Grosel was history. Near where Joe's body had been discovered in November, a small memorial, a mute reminder of the drama that unfolded here just months before. But away from here, where he grew up, perplexing questions.
And once the funeral was completed and all of that aspect of it was done, then I started thinking about back to the investigation, back to what happened, back to what was done, and then started getting right back into, okay, so what happened here? How come my son's not alive? Why isn't he alive?
Spring 2004. 6 months gone since Joe's death. His father had a lot of questions. Why did it take 3 weeks to find him? If he was in the water all that time, how come there was no water in his lungs? Why was his body half naked? Somehow a hooded pullover and 2 other shirts came off. Why not his shoes? In the months that followed, Ron Grozel began to suspect that the image of the institution had priority over the investigation of Joe's death. He wanted to know what really happened, regardless of potential fallout. Back in November, he'd been encouraged by public statements from the military investigation by its leader, Navy Lieutenant Ryan Snow.
You said you're not ruling anything in, not ruling anything out, so is foul play still a possibility?
Well, it's only prudent of us to ensure that we leave no stone unturned here while we're conducting this investigation. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of information that will be gleaned from the further medical examination of the body.
But what Ron Grozel didn't know that day was that the NIS had been winding down its investigation, preparing to return to headquarters in Ottawa, even before Joe's body was recovered.
After the body was recovered, they did leave town. Now that goes contrary to all logic in my view, in terms of, you know, if you're looking for a missing person, that's one thing, but once you have a body, that's another, and you should be escalating, not reducing, in my view.
And there was something else he didn't know about the NIS investigation. Even before Joe's body surfaced, they'd pretty well made up their minds about what happened to him.
We will obviously be doing a lot of liaison with the coroner in regards to the direction that this investigation will take at this time.
And liaise he did. November 14th, according to his field notes, Lieutenant Snow informed the Ontario Coroner's Office that as far as the NIS were concerned, Joe killed himself. Suicide, according to the notes, was a high degree of probability. Foul play was ruled out. That hasty judgment would, in hindsight, block a wider 5-year search for answers to a simple question. What killed Joe Grozel? It would take the Ontario coroner 7 months to produce a report on Joe Grozel's death, and it couldn't have been less informative. There was no trace of drugs or alcohol in the body, no mention of suicide. The stunning revelation for the family was that the autopsy had revealed no specific cause of death. Nothing. He was dead, period. But they couldn't specify when, where, or how he died. They couldn't even say for sure that he had drowned. In 7 months, the best they could come up with was no specific cause of death identified. In the absence of certainty about the cause of death, that awful theory that he'd killed himself continued to hang like a cloud over the memory of Joe Grozel. A family that had been hoping that somehow solid information would mitigate their grief found themselves in limbo, profoundly disappointed in the people they'd been counting on to figure out what happened.
We had the coroner's office, we had Kingston Police involved, we had the National Investigation Service involved. So we have all those agencies involved, and none of these guys could come up with any answers for us. The coroner's office should have been able to identify cause of death.
So how did the military investigators come to the conclusion that Joe's death was suicide? Nobody knows for sure. But the NIS seemed to have based their theory on a list of 16 factors that persuaded them that Joe was in despair. Many of the items on the list were based on subjective comments that were, in many cases, taken out of context. The military investigation seized on casual observations that Joe looked depressed or sad, that he complained more than usual, that he had made ambiguous comments about life's futility, that he considered suicide once in high school. Speculation that was hard, if not impossible, to verify. One possibly serious suggestion on the list, Joe and Melissa Haggart were on the verge of breaking up. A theory she has emphatically denied in the one public interview she's given and in formal statements she's given to investigators. There were hints that Coach Norman planned to cut him from the team, which would have been a devastating prospect if it had been true.
You know, this theory that he was going to get cut it came from somewhere that I don't know, and we were already 6 weeks into our season, so there was just no substance to that rumor at all.
Coach Norman recalls the NIS seemed fixated on suicide from the outset.
The NIS came in, and they questioned, you know, all the members of the team. They questioned me on a number of occasions, and you know, the line of questioning was such that it seemed that they were trying to focus in on the fact that maybe Joe took his own life. You know, just, you know, there was a lot of questions around, were you going to cut him? I heard you were going to cut him. He wasn't playing a lot of minutes. Do you think it was hard on him with his brother being an All-Canadian? Stuff like that. And it just seemed to me like there was a certain amount of tunnel vision on their part as to the way they were conducting their investigation.
For the people who knew him best, speculation about suicide made no sense. He coped as well as anyone with life at RMC. Kevin DeLude.
You know, it's busy, it's hectic, it's stressful, but I don't recall him being any depressed or sad or overwhelmed. From what I remember, he was in control of everything around him.
Lieutenant Colonel Rod MacDonald, who led the search for Joe Grosel before the NIS became involved, was the only military official who would appear on camera. When we raised the theory about suicide, he seemed shocked to hear about it. The NIS arrived at a conclusion that it was a suicide.
Did they?
Well, it's in the probable suicide. Foul play ruled out. It's in the investigators' notes. What did you think of that possibility?
That's why I questioned you right now, because I've never seen that, and I've never heard anybody specifically say that. I can't necessarily accept it. At first blush, I might have been able to, not knowing the individual, and just with the superficial information that was available. And the more that I became familiar with the family and what they had, it struck me as less and less likely that he would be the kind of individual to do that sort of thing.
So, if Joe Grosel didn't kill himself, how did he end up in Kingston Harbor? And how could he have been there and not be noticed by the divers who, just a few days before his body was discovered, had been searching that same area just a few feet from the campus? A young guy dies, young guy found in the water, put himself there.
Mm-hmm.
What's wrong with that conclusion from your point of view?
Well, from my point of view, having that situation doesn't fit with the guy that I know, the Joe that I know. Joe wouldn't have done that.
For Ron Grosel, suicide was too convenient, a tidy answer that closed a potentially awkward file. But it didn't answer any of the most obvious questions.
I'd like someone to explain to me how come there was no body spotted or seen in that water or picked up by the sonar and by the divers. And could somebody explain to me how a body shows up there when it wasn't there 4 days before, anywhere in that bay before?
Hard questions that raise new doubts about that crucial first investigation of the death of Joe Grosel.
And every time we started asking questions, we weren't allowed to go there. We were stopped.
Graduation day at the Royal Military College. A passage never to be forgotten. But this is more than just another academic milestone. They are now military officers, bonded in the service of their country and to each other. But for Ron Grosel, it is a day for bitter reflection. The son, who should have graduated in 2005, will be forever frozen in year 3 of his 4-year program. The passage of time has been unhelpful. There are too many unanswered questions. What really happened to his son Joe on a rainy night in October 2003? By early 2004, those who wanted answers included the Chief Coroner of Ontario. He asked the Ontario Provincial Police to investigate Joe's death.
We have all of the avenues open to us. We're not ruling any of them out.
The first autopsy report had been vague, couldn't even say how he died. It didn't help that military investigators, after what the coroner called an unimpressive investigation, had jumped to the dubious conclusion he'd killed himself. Joe's body was exhumed. Deputy Coroner Jim Cairns promised a more thorough probe this time round.
We're looking for marks in the body. We're looking for trace evidence that may have not been noted the first time round.
The second autopsy would, unlike the military investigation, look for evidence of murder. For the Grosel family, the new investigation was promising, but they couldn't help wondering what went wrong the first time.
When they talked about doing an exhumation and doing a second autopsy, red flags start going up saying, wait a minute, why are we doing this? You don't do anything twice unless you didn't do it right the first time, is usually the case. So that started raising, concerns all over the place about, okay, so what's going on here?
In the end, the concerns were justified. A far more thorough autopsy, more than a year after Joe Grosel's death, still couldn't determine what killed him. The trail was cold and getting colder. In early 2005, the OPP thought they'd found a clue here. A security camera near RMC revealed 4 figures walking away from the campus at 1:10 a.m. on the morning Joe disappeared, then 40 minutes later caught them walking back. They asked the public for help, but it had been 16 months. The lead went nowhere. The OPP interviewed just about everyone who'd ever known Joe Grosel. They turned up tantalizing leads that had been overlooked by the military investigators in 2003. One of the more intriguing, a graduate of RMC who had maintained close ties with students throughout the years. He sold financial services and cultivated a lot of business among cadets. As a former cadet, he knew his way around and seemed to have unrestricted access to the dorms. But when some cadets complained of sexual advances, the administration tried to bar him from the campus. Lieutenant Colonel Rod MacDonald.
He'd visited the dorms a few times and there was complaints. I am aware of the fact that the college responded to that individual's actions and asked him to cease and desist.
But it seems he didn't cease or desist, and when the OPP found out he had a history of sexual escapades involving boys and young men, they tracked him down and quizzed him aggressively on his whereabouts the night Joe Grosel disappeared. But it was another lead that military investigators somehow overlooked in the fall of 2003. In 2005, it took the OPP detectives nowhere. Fall 2006, another ray of hope for the Grosel family. There was to be a coroner's inquest. Surely this would uncover something.
It's been a long time. It's been a frustrating 3 years for us. Waiting and waiting and waiting just to get some kind of answers, and hopefully we'll get some.
But the inquest quickly bogged down and came to a halt when Ron Grosel tried to question the competence of the early military investigation by the NIS. The inquest resumed 6 months later, but the NIS investigation was still off limits. Ron Grosel could barely suppress his anger.
We now have more questions than we have answers. More questions than what we had prior to starting this inquest.
The inquest serves only the purpose of asking questions around the five questions that are required to be answered. That is the who died, when, where, manner, and cause of death. We were focused, and we were kept focused strictly on questions that had to do with the 5 questions. But there's nothing there. There's no answers there. And the coroner's office knew this going into the inquest. And every time we started asking questions about who was in charge, what investigation was done, well, what was done, when was it done. We weren't allowed to go there. We were stopped.
In short, the failure by the military's National Investigation Service, the NIS, to come up with hard information in the early days of the investigation may well have doomed all subsequent attempts to find out what really happened to Joe Grosel. There were three possible outcomes: murder, suicide, and accidental death. But the NIS settled quickly on the one that puts the onus of responsibility on the victim, suicide, and yet the evidence for that finding has been substantially discredited. So it is fair to ask, was that verdict just a convenient outcome for the military, or was it compromised by a lack of competence? The NIS, often referred to as an elite police force in the military, is usually assigned to special jobs that the regular MPs can't handle.
Well, there's nothing special in terms of training, or in terms of additional qualification, or in terms even of experience.
Retired Colonel Michel Drapeau is now an Ottawa lawyer specializing in military issues and an observer of the NIS since it was formed in 1997. Isn't it fair to ask, shouldn't the people going into it be very special people and specially trained?
Well, I think a better question would be, does the National Investigative Service, is it equipped, in fact, to conduct those sensitive investigations, particularly when you're dealing with criminal crimes such as murder, for instance, or sexual assault or whatever?
So try and answer. I mean, do we really need it?
My short answer to that is no. We have, across Canada, competent provincial and municipal police forces.
Lieutenant Colonel Rod MacDonald isn't convinced that any other agency could have done a better job in the case of Joe Grosel.
There's always an opportunity to look back, hindsight is 20/20, to say that somebody else might have done it more effectively. That will always be a question, I suppose.
We're sitting here trying to solve a mystery without the benefit of any serious evidence. What happened to Joe Grosel?
I want to, in my own heart, believe that an accident of some sort occurred. I don't know, as we move further and further away, is there that one classic bit of information that's going to come forward at some point in time or another that will explain all of this? In my own heart, I don't believe that there is.
What took the life of Joe Grosel, and when, and where, and why? Joe's family can't bring themselves to accept the hard reality that there might never be an answer to such fundamental questions. Which is why, after 5 long years, they struggle to keep Joe's memory alive, hoping memory will motivate a continued search for truth about his death. It is another autumn. Another crop of future officers start their 4-year program here.
My plan is to migrate towards...
For the Grosels, it has become important to stay in touch with RMC. They have unfinished business here, and they don't want anybody to forget it.
I keep pushing because I wouldn't be able to live with myself down the road 5 years if I hadn't, because I'll always be asking myself the question, did I do everything possible to find out what happened to my son? And every time I go to bed at night, I have to think about that. And I'm not going to have to answer that question down the road, because when I'm done, I'll have said, yes, I did everything I could.